Thursday.
Yeah, in the morning sometime.
And then Thursday afternoon, day after polls. So, which is kind of good. Zoom time to work on stuff. And then we'll talk about the center. I was thinking about with this the other day, with the new center. I had some other things that's where you can see that too, and they do all kinds of art.
Oh, I got an email.
Yes, I said Ellen got an email asking whether you want to be an affiliate. It's just we'll list
I know,
people we
yes.
work with and projects.
No, you're measuring also exchange and pooling.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just.
I have the clicker.
Okay.
Will go over.
Okay.
But, I will go and sit so that.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. Let's start our seminar. We are very happy today because we have among us two big stars on the comparative study of digital inequalities. They came to an event promoted by CETIC, a Center for the Study of Digital Issues in São Paulo. Yeah, thanks. Okay. So they became to the launch of this book, which is a study on the geographic of digital inequalities in Brazil and in the city of São Paulo. It was launched today, and the work of both Professor Karen Mossberger and Ellen Helsper was a source of inspiration for this study. They are both very influential on this study. So the book is here, and you can get it for free after the seminar. So I would like just to introduce both. Professor Karen Mossberger, who is seated over in front of us, is the Frank and June Sexton Professor in the School of Public Affairs at Arizona State University, and she is also the director of the Arizona State University Center on Technology, Data, and Society. She published several books on this subject: Digital Cities, the Internet, and the Geography of Opportunity, published in 2012. Digital Citizenship, the Internet, Participation, and Society, published in 2008. Virtual Inequality, Beyond the Digital Divide, published in 2003. And she also received the Donald C. Stone Scholar Award from the International Section on Intergovernmental Administration and Management of the American Society for Public Administration. She was elected a fellow in the National Academy of Public Administration in 2016. She served as chair of the American the section on urban politics of the American Political Science Association, and she is currently the chair of the Committee on Electronic Democracy at IPSA. So we are very happy to have you here. And we also have among us Professor Ellen Helsper, who will make her presentation first. She is the director of the Master Program on Media and Communication at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is very much involved on International Center on digital skills to tangible outcomes called DISTO, which I imagine he will talk about in a minute. She's very much involved in consulting, in making as a consultant for governments on digital issues. The third in commercial section. She holds also a position as a visiting scholar in the School for Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the PUC Chile, at CETIC, where she works as a consultant for a long time. And she held similar positions at Microsoft, at the New York University, at University of Twente, and the University of Oxford. So we have among us today to talk about the geography of digital inequalities, two very influential and important scholars on these issues. So thanks again for coming, but I want to let them talk to you. So please, Ellen, first. After Ellen's talk, we'll listen to Professor Karins, and then we'll open to the discussion. And I would like to thank Fabio for the generosity of extending their stay among us to come to our university.
Okay, I don't know. Do you need actually the microphone for recording? Probably.
Yeah,
so
because it's being...
yeah. So I'll see, because I tend to like to stand. It's a bit strange when you're behind the desk. Okay, we'll do Madonna. Here we go. Okay. So, yes, thank you very much for the introduction. As you already said, I work on this project to kind of coordinate it with the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project, which is a project that is done in a lot of countries around the world. Brazil is part of that. The study, actually, what we did in the book is based on some methodology that we developed for the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes projects in London and Great Britain. It's also been taken up in the United States, in Los Angeles. We're doing studies in Shanghai with this, Johannesburg, Sydney, Santiago in Chile, all that kind of aspect of how social and digital inequalities are related. So that's what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about today. All these countries, I'll try to talk a little bit about the methodology of some of the studies that I will be presenting here, but all of these countries have slightly different ways of approaching data collection and the kinds of studies that they do, because one of the important points of the project is that you can't look at these issues of the links between social and digital inequalities without putting that in the context of the country that you're doing that in. And while we want to study the universal, we also really want to know what is specific about a particular country. So what lessons can we learn from what happens in other parts of the world? What are the kind of general theoretical principles and the hypotheses that we could say are kind of universally answered in the same way, but also what are the things that make a difference? And this is why it's very important for us to look not just across different countries, but also within countries at different sections of the population, and how, for example, interventions that try to get people online or teach them skills might have very different impacts depending on where you are and how you introduce these programs. So I'll try to talk a little bit about that. I want to focus in this presentation on two aspects. One is the kind of more theoretical approach that underlies the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project, which is based partly on a paper that I wrote in 2012, which is called the Corresponding Fields framework to looking at digital inequalities. I'll talk a little bit about what that means, because it's shaped the way we do our research and our analysis. That's the first part. And then I want to finish by talking about the new developments that are taking place in the project itself, but they reflect the broader kind of developments in the field, which are bringing further nuance and complexity to this debate. And because I have no idea how familiar you are with this kind of field of digital inequalities, so I decided that maybe I'll start with just going very quickly through the kind of theoretical development in this field. So apologies if you already know a lot about this. This might be a bit of a repetition. But so what we have, always the assumption, this is kind of the framework that we use for this project. The assumption is that the digital is not a separate thing, right? It's embedded in historical, like a social world that has historical processes that have led to inequalities and power dynamics and economic distributions of resources in all kinds of ways. And so that these kind of structures and historical processes influence how a variety of resources is distributed, and reflecting the kind of developments in inequalities theory more in general. We don't look just at economic resources, but we look at things like social capital, inequalities in the distribution of social capital, inequalities in the distribution of kind of the kind of civic and cultural and personal well-being resources. And I'll explain why especially this emphasis on well-being has become really important lately, rather than on kind of physical resources that you might have, because that's also reflected in the field of digital inequalities. So these kind of the unequal distribution of resources and the historical processes that have always been there, in which these digital technologies are embedded, they are designed within that framework and they are used within that kind of context. They throw up certain barriers, but also certain enablers for people to engage in that digital world, and they determine to a large extent the access that people have to technologies, the kind of access, how ubiquitous is the access, how many different devices do we have, is it there everywhere where we work and live, or is it just, do we just have a particular device in the telecentro that's around the corner but nowhere else, right? Those kind of things. Or maybe we have only a mobile phone and nothing else, not to access the internet. And the attitudes or the dispositions that we have towards technology. What is it good for? What is it supposed to be used for? Is it something that people like me should be using? Would it be beneficial? Yeah. This is what the beginning of the kind of theorization, which very much overlaps when we look at inequalities theories traditionally, with where it was really about, do you have something or not? And a lot of the literature continues, in fact, to use the technology or the terminology of divides, digital divides, the kind of separation between those who are in and out of that digital world. But the debate has moved on, and I'll go a little bit quicker now because it kind of reflects that, is that it moved on. It's like access is really not enough. We know that. Yes, just having access without having the skills to be able to use the technology is kind of basically useless. Yeah, even if with a mobile phone, to be able to use it properly, to get, to be able to engage with it in a very broad way, you need to have different types of skills. And one of the things that the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project has focused on quite a lot is thinking about what these skills are, because historically they've been focused quite a lot on technical skills. And this is something that is actually quite problematic in the results that I'll show you of the research that we do, is that narrow focus actually is not very beneficial if you want to overcome inequalities of various kinds. And then also we are saying, like, it's not just about whether you use the internet or technologies for anything, but can you use it for whenever it is that you need something to be done, when it's good to use technology to do that, is that available? So that's what's called like the second level of the digital divide. Now, I want to talk, in the paper that, I don't know if Fabio distributed that, but the paper, Compound and Sequential Digital Inequalities, I want to talk a little bit about kind of what is behind that. So compound disadvantage is really understanding that when people have one type of disadvantage, that is very often combined with other types of disadvantage. And this works across the spectrum. This works when we look at within those boxes of access and skills. Somebody lacks one skill, they often lack another skill. But also across. If somebody has lower quality access, they often are also the same kinds of people who don't have skills. And this is what we see, if we think about a little bit about intersectionality in a theory of inequality traditionally, we can see how this is compound. One thing goes on top of the other. So I wanted to illustrate that with this research. I've worked in Oxford on the Oxford Internet Surveys, which are part of the World Internet Project, which is, again, a global project which looks at use and non-use of the internet, very broad, representative, face-to-face research, surveys in all these countries. I think it's now 32 countries around the world that are doing this project. And they've been going for a very long time, from when the internet wasn't used that much. So it's not panel data, but it is longitudinal. So I wanted to show you the reasons that people who don't use the internet have given for non-use of the internet. So we can see that there's people without skills, 74% in 2005. In 2013, I have the data for 2015, but there's not much change. You can see there's hardly any change between those years. Yeah, and it's probably not, as I will argue in a minute, that people haven't become more skilled, but it's that the environment has become more complex, and different people have gotten, are now the ones who are not using the internet. So you will notice that there's one that's missing. We can also see access. Around 50% of the population doesn't have access. 68 is, what is the other one? Oh, sorry. It says that it's cost that's really limited them. So there's actually very little change. Even though cost has gone down, things have gone down, it's very little change. So the one that's missing is skills, and now I have to kind of sneak peek. So, or interest. The people who say that they're not online because they don't have interest, in 2005 was about 49%, I think, 48. Does anybody want to guess what it was in 2013? How, like, if you know that about 48% in 2005 said, I'm not interested and that's why I'm not using technology, what do you think it might have been in 2015? Anybody want to shout a number? Okay, we're going to do this by hands. Just want to make sure that you're actually understanding what I'm saying as well. It's a little test. Okay, so it was 50%. How many of you think it's lower than 50%? Okay, yeah, 1 or 2. Okay, so the rest of you, who thinks it stayed more or less the same? Okay, 1 or 2 as well. Okay, so I'm assuming that the rest of you does understand my slightly weird English and assumes that it's higher. Yeah, okay, so here we go. Right? So what we see now is that the people who are not online, most of them say, actually, I'm not interested. And this is not an age thing, because I've taken the people out over 65, okay, of this sample. So why is this an indication of compound or cumulative disadvantage? Because the population who's not online in 2005 is quite a different one from who's not online in 2015, and it's about the same now. It's gone down a little bit in the last year. But so what happened is that if you talk about public policy, in 2005, you had a relatively easy job because people either didn't have access or they said, I don't have the skills or I'm not really interested. So if you gave them access, they would go online and start using it. What happens now is this is what we called like the emergence of an kind of entrenched, some people use the term underclass, digital kind of excluded underclass, where these are people who say like, I don't have access, I don't have the skills, it's too expensive, and I'm not interested. So you can't do it. They have multiple reasons why it's hard for them to be offline. Yeah. So if you do public policy or an intervention, you can't just do one thing. And I'll show you now, picking up pace, more and more like results that keep confirming these kinds of patterns, that it becomes more and more complicated. Yeah. So here we see skills, yeah, this estimated skill level. So this is people estimating their own skill. And we can see that those people who are higher educated and employed, they've always said that they had higher skills. Yeah. The people who are higher educated and unemployed, they're kind of catching up with that group. Yeah. What happens when we look at this one? Those people who are and lower educated and unemployed, there's been almost no change in how low they evaluate, you know, their ability to use technologies. And that's because, and we all know this, sometimes the skill that you had in 2003 is absolutely useless now because technology is different. Yeah, and we see this with broadband, and we see that it's kind of amplification. People don't catch up on that bottom. Yeah, even if they get more access or they get more skills, in comparison relatively to this group, yeah, who's also gotten many more skills, and they stay the same, but it's kind of this parallel. So these inequalities are not improving, even when access is provided, because it's become more complex to use the stuff. One of the things that is missing from this figure that I showed to you in the beginning is what we have been calling the third level digital divide, or third level digital inequalities. Because in the end, and I said this yesterday as well, what matters is not really the technology side of it. It's what people get out of the technology. What are these kinds of, you know, what is it that people do with the technology? As I already said, it's not just do you do anything, do you do a range of things when it benefits you? But also, what do you get out of it? What are the beneficial outcomes that you get from using technologies? And what are the kind of negative outcomes that you are able to avoid. Yeah, and this last thing is kind of a newer addition to it, because a lot of assumption in the digital inequalities interventions and literature is that being online is a good thing, so the more the better, right? But as I'll show in the rest of my presentation, there's actually quite a lot of inequalities in this bit, in avoiding negative outcomes. Now, it's important to understand, if you want to understand the From Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project, that the main premise, and this is why there's outcomes at the end, it's actually the most important thing, is that where we see inequalities emerging that people hadn't thought of before, is that people with the same access and skills level, maybe also same positive attitudes, using the technology for the exact same way, have very different outcomes depending where they come from. So what we see, for example, is that people who have a family history of kind of exclusion, economic exclusion, when they go online and they use financial services or something like that, it's much more likely that they will get defrauded. Yeah. Although people have more money, so if it happens to somebody with more money, they often, it's more money that they lose, but they have the kind of skills to then deal with that. They call their bank, they say, block my accounts, I'll get it back. Or looking for jobs. I'm going to stick a little bit with the economic one because that's the next figure that I have. But looking for jobs on a job site, for example, people who have a long history of unemployment, they use exactly the same job. They use exactly the same sites or even different sites to look for jobs. Now, what is interesting is that what they get, they often do find jobs. But often these jobs are not good. They're precarious. They don't allow them to really build an income, So even if they have achieved an outcome, like finding a job, it's often not a very good job. Or if they don't find a job, yeah, for them it's a very different experience than for the people who have a lot of resources, who know, because they say, didn't work out this time. Next time I will find a job. I know my friend, he also used that site, he got a job, or she got a job. While the people who come from disadvantaged background, they think that there's somebody sitting behind that website saying, oh, this person? No. Yeah, I look at you. So they come from a history of rejection, and that's what we see. They see reflected. This exact same thing happens to people online, but the experience and the outcomes of it is quite different. So I want to show you, I'll skip the definition, but it's kind of better. So I want to talk to you about DISTO and show you some results of the DISTO presentation. So what is the DISTO methodology? Again, I said different countries have different approaches to this, but the kind of underlying principle is that all the countries have to do, we design a survey. There's kind of a base survey that you adapt to the specific country context, translate it if needed. And we do always a validity testing within the country through cognitive interviews. We also do reliability testing through small representative samples of the population, so actual administration of the survey, to look at measurement and variance, whether the skills and things react in the same way across different countries and across different groups. Yeah, because what we want is to have a measurement instrument that really measures actual differences between countries or groups, and not just because the translation was off or something like that. Yeah, we want to have robust measurement instruments that can be applied across different contexts. So we adjust the questionnaire based on that. And then in the field work, in most of the countries up until now, because of where it started, it's been representative samples of internet users. Yeah, because, for example, in the Netherlands, which I'll show you the data in a minute, they 98% of the population is online, yeah. And if you do a nationally representative sample, you're not even going to get a lot of the people who are not online because they're online for very specific reasons. They don't use the internet because they're in a care home or they're really ill, or it's very rare that they really don't use it. So I will talk about the Netherlands in that case, because the Netherlands is used by a lot of countries to think about what would happen in the future when we have a really high diffusion, relative good structures. Yeah. So we do comparative analysis, but I'll show about that. So this is table. I'm just going to explain what is in there. You don't have to read all the numbers. These are really basic start of kind of analysis that we do, right? Just correlational analysis. Now, one of the principles of the corresponding fields framework is that this kind of compound disadvantage in terms of uses and outcomes is stronger within specific domains. So if somebody doesn't have economic resources, when they get access to the internet, they are less likely to get the benefits that go with the economic type of activities. It doesn't say anything about whether they can get social capital outcomes or personal well-being outcomes. Of course, disadvantages are compound and related, but we say that the relationships are strongest within specific domains. And that's kind of what we find here. That, unsurprisingly, if you use, the internet for one type of economic activity, you're also much more likely to use it for one other activity. And it doesn't really correlate with other types of activities as strongly. And why is this important? Because a lot of public policies and interventions, they say, oh, we're going to solve the digital inequality problem because we have, let's say, a lot of older people, and they're really excited about talking to their grandchildren. This is always the example that I get. Right? Oh, but you just get them to talk to their grandchildren, and then they're online. Right? But we can see that that doesn't necessarily take them beyond social interactions with people they know. Yeah? So getting somebody to look for a job online doesn't mean that they will also be good at finding healthcare information. Yeah? So these kinds of things we find over and over. What we also see is that this might seem also logical, but like that between the people, that it's much more likely if you use the technology for a certain aspect, you're also more likely to get the outcome. But this is where it gets actually really interesting. And again, don't have to look at them all, so I can answer any questions about how the methodology that we used actually worked. But what we see is that certain type of uses have much more what we call collateral benefits than others. And certain types of skill have much more collateral benefits. So what we see for economic uses, I'll go to the other circle first. But what we see here is that economic uses are very directly related with the same outcome. I look for a house or I do banking and I get outcomes that are very much related to that use. What we'll see in the next slide when I look at social capital, which include like political engagement and civic engagement, is that uses that are social, like using Facebook or WhatsApp, actually have benefits in areas that have nothing to do with the social. Like people who use it a lot for social matters, people who have a lot of these skills, social and content creation skills, actually have a lot of these collateral benefits of use. Yeah. So some uses are more beneficial than others in the way that they lead to outcomes. And this I just wanted to point out is that, well, obviously you need to know how to use technologies that are the operational skills, but knowledge. They on their own are not enough to translate use into outcomes. To really be able to translate use into outcomes, you need to have a much broader range of skills, because these will allow you to use it in a very technical way, but not to translate that into these benefits or the mission of risk. So what we can see here, and this is just visualized, but there's a lot more arrows. Yeah, here is when you do one of these things, you also get benefits in the other. People who have a lot of social contacts with a lot of friends and family, they also tend to engage more civically, yeah, which is like more political or activist or engage with the government. And you're saying like, okay, now obviously our task as researchers is going to be how to explain that, and that's a little bit harder. But just this paper that I'm working on right now with Alexander van Deursen is looking at these negative outcomes. Now here I'm going to have to take a sneak peek. Is that what we see here is that, went too quickly, is that economic outcomes or economic resources, so these are the resources that people have, education and income, are related to having more negative outcomes here. So people with higher levels of education, for example, are much more likely or much less likely to have negative outcomes in the personal field, like get bad health advice or go to a movie that was really ridiculous or something like that. It's very broad, that field. Same social cultural. They're a lot less likely to have negative interactions online or to find people, like sign up for organizations that they really don't care for or that they have negative. The social ones, social kind of people with social capital, you can see that they logically have social. It's way too fast. They logically have social cultural outcomes, but what is interesting is cultural is quite a broad category, and these are what we might call identity categories. That's the kind of cultural resources, yeah? Gender, ethnicity, these kinds of things that come with a certain position in the world. They are related to negative outcomes in ways that they weren't even for the positive outcomes, yeah. And we see the same thing, that counts even when we control for access, attitude, skills, and use, yeah. So this is what we see, and what is interesting here, this can't show it, but if we talk about skills, is that these skills, people who have higher levels of skills, not technical skills, they make no difference for negative outcomes. So you could be very tech savvy, but they make no difference in you being able to avoid negative outcomes. It's those other types of skills again, yeah, the softer skills that we're talking about. You know, how broad your use is. The broader your use is, the fewer negative outcomes you're likely to get. But if you are a very narrow user of one thing, you're also very much more likely to get negative outcomes in that field. Yeah? So it becomes complicated quickly. So what are the lessons that we learned? And then I'll move on to what the kind of work is that we're doing right now. So first of all, the amplification of inequality takes place in very specific domains. They kind of, you know, stream. And if you do policies, you therefore need to really know what resources a person has or what exactly it is that they're doing with the technology. But what we've also learned is that infrastructure and access is not enough. It's essential. Without access, you can't do anything, you can't get any outcomes. Skill and awareness training are not enough because we can see that people with the same level of skills, yeah, men and women doing the same activity have different outcomes. Yeah. Content provision is not enough, therefore also. So how do we explain this? Yeah, and this is the kind of thing that where we said, okay, we have to stop looking at this as an individual process. You know, this is not a meritocracy, this social digital world. It doesn't mean that if an individual gets access and they get the skills and they start using the technology, that all of a sudden everything is solved. What we see is that these are kind of embedded. Yeah, we need to look at intersections of inequalities. We need to look at the networked relativity of inequalities, yeah. And we need to look at how geographically embedded they are. And I know that you're going to talk much more about the geographic one, so I'll just be brief on that. So intersectionality, yeah. So we need to understand in the intersectionality theory that it's not just that it's compound, that, you know, somebody who is disadvantaged in one way is also likely to be disadvantaged in another way, but actually that the combination of different types of disadvantages leads to a whole new type of exclusion. Yeah, that we need to look at how these things interact. And in that, we need to look, because this is kind of when we look at intersectionality as a theory, we need to think not only of you know, what happens to women, but what happens to women in very particular contexts where we have very specific backgrounds. So we need to understand what is universal about a certain type of disadvantage, but we also need to understand, you know, that not everybody is the same. Yeah. So this is a quick graph to show when we talk about vulnerability, and vulnerability is things like, this is young people who have emotional problems at home, they live in disadvantaged neighborhood, and this is interesting because this kind of challenges our way of thinking until we've done what we've done so far. So we can see that those with high skill levels and high kind of, something disappeared, high levels of vulnerability, yeah, they are the most likely to get negative outcomes. Yeah, this difference is statistically insignificant. So if you have, it doesn't matter, you know, if you have low skill levels, it doesn't actually matter if you have a lot of emotional problems or not. And what is really interesting is that those who don't have emotional problems or are not vulnerable in a kind of social, psychological sense, when you give them skills training, they are able to avoid negative outcomes. So what does that mean? And policymakers, do we tell you, you know, you're working with vulnerable youth, don't teach them digital skills because they are likely to use it to get negative outcomes, right? No. So what do we have to do? What we say, you have to deal with the vulnerability. Yeah, you have to deal with the vulnerability. It's not a digital intervention. Yeah, okay. So networked relativity. I don't know how This is a very big field of relative deprivation that I can't really go through. But what I'll do is I'll go to this, which kind of looks at it, which says that, again, it's not an individual thing. Yeah, for people to want to change a situation, to realize that there is a problem, yeah, as a society, but also as individuals, we need to not only look at poverty, what do you not have, but we need to look at what they have in comparison to other people. So in our internationally comparative project, if you live in a city like London and you know a certain basic level of programming, you're still not going to get a job, although maybe that's not the best example, because there's so many other people who have that same kind of skill. Yeah. So that person might have a resource, but in comparison with other people, it's not that beneficial. What is also important is how you feel about it. Because if you think, well, I don't have it and another person has it, but it's not really important, so I'm still not going to change anything. And then what the real point about this is that this needs to all be in place for people to want to change things. Yeah, you need to feel that it's unjust, and you need to feel not only that you have something that the other person has, but you need to feel that it's unjust and that there's a systematic reason behind this. You need to start realizing, for things to structurally change, not just individual, structural change, is that this is something that's happening to people who are like me across the country or across the city that I live in. We need to take collective action to change that, because otherwise you stick with the give the people skills training. And this is where I'm going to stop, is this kind of social digital ecology. What this all leads to is that we need to think of people as embedded in particular environments, and these environments shape how we use technology. So you don't live as a woman, but you live as a woman in a very specific network of people who have certain norms and values around technologies in a very particular neighborhood that have these kinds of material, you know, like, are technologies everywhere, are they nowhere? Yeah, those kinds of things. Yeah. And I won't do that because I think we're running out of time, but we have this project. So in terms of the methodology, I won't show you the actual maps, but you can play around with them because we've created them. But so the methodology that we're using to do this is because it's really multi-level. We map it at the national level, look at with multiple stakeholders across different data sources that we map on the country. Then we map that on publicly available maps, how all these aspects come together. We follow this up with in-depth qualitative work in areas that are unexpectedly digitally included or excluded. And then we look at changes over time, yeah, whether neighborhoods actually improve or not. And that's, I think, what Karen's going to talk about, to see what we might use as solutions. So I am going to skip through all these beautiful maps so you can see that you go from very specific to very general. And then the qualitative work really illustrates how important the actual environment is where you live in. And this is the conclusion slide. So, yes, so we need to really understand what is the implication for policy and practice, and that's really where I'll finish, is that this cannot be done by a single organization or a single government. Yeah, the impact of the changes that the digital has are across all these domains of our lives. So we can't do this just in the Department for Education, yeah, or in the Department for pensions is another one that we have, yeah, or the health department. We need to have multi-stakeholder approaches, and that's also why in digital inequalities research, and you're probably much better at this because you're kind of inequalities researchers, but in inequalities research, people really have to start looking at these other types of theories like intersectionality or networked inequalities or neighborhood effects, because it's really missing. Up until now, it's very individualistic focused, like what can we do to an individual so that they might start using it. And both in research and in policy, we need more kind of collective action to really, because these are structural issues, they are not individual issues anymore. Right? Okay. That's where I'll stop. I don't think we didn't talk about, were we going to go straight into the presentation? The questions at the end, yeah?
And then we'll both answer questions at the end.
Yeah. That's yours. Is that coming? Yeah. Here you are. So you can use this or use that.
Oh, my, it's just a graphic back there. It's not even a map. It doesn't come out that way. I can see it here. Anyway, it doesn't. it doesn't matter. So there is a graphic back here, but you can see the title, and that's the main thing. Okay, should
We
I
are
be
recording, yes.
Okay. So thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation here. As a political scientist, I'm really happy to be here in the political science department at the University of Sao Paulo. So I have done some work. So you'll see this is a co-authored paper. It's part of a book manuscript that we just finished last week and that we're sending out for review. It's basically one chapter on outcomes for metropolitan areas. But what before starting this, I'd like to say that, as a political scientist, and my colleague Carolyn Tolbert has written with me for a long time. She's also a political scientist. We have written about digital citizenship, or the ability of individuals to participate in society online. And, around this concept of what citizenship means, we've argued that it's especially important to look at internet use for political participation and also for economic opportunity, because those are core aspects, at least in the U.S., of what citizenship means. And it varies across societies, but in many societies, both of those aspects are important. In terms of what I'm going to show today, though, this is a shift from looking at outcomes for individuals for, political knowledge or political participation or wages. It's a shift to looking at how internet use matters for communities, because there are assumptions in public policy that it does matter for communities. The UN Sustainability Development Goals for NGOs, in the U.S., the National Broadband Plan. But we haven't had really good evidence on that. Also, in today's context in the United States, it's especially important to look at these issues, at outcomes for communities, and what may help to increase opportunity, economic opportunity across different kinds of communities. We've had a lot of debate in recent years about places left behind as well as people left behind. And that's part of some of the conflicts that came out around the 2016 election, the political divisions in the U.S., shifts in partisanship and in voting patterns. A lot of that is aligned around shifting inequalities in the U.S. And increasingly, they've always been patterned by place in the U.S., but they're becoming increasingly so. Moretti, who's an economist, talks about the great divergence. Your paycheck matters more on where you live than your resume. Florida, who's an urbanist, talks about inequality within metropolitan areas and within cities. And then there's this think tank about the great reshuffling, both urban and rural inequalities. And we see this again in the press about two Americas growing further apart. And technology's role in this. In part, there's a narrative about superstar cities, which are large metropolitan areas, especially in the U.S. on the coasts. Think Silicon Valley in California, or, there was the Amazon competition. New York and Washington won out until New York dropped out later. But anyway, they got the prize. So there are these certain large metropolitan areas that have gotten a lot of technology investment and have gotten really rich when other cities, major cities, are falling behind. I come from Detroit, a former manufacturing center. Detroit is not a winner in this. But, these superstar cities tend to be really big, dense metropolitan areas, and there's a reason for that. So there are these structural changes in the economy. It's not a short-term change. After World War II, we saw more equality, wage gaps narrowing across different communities. But since the 1980s, they've been widening across different cities and different regions in the U.S. Of course, this sped up during the big recession that we just had 10 years ago, but it preceded that, and it's continued afterward. And we know these have important long-term effects. I don't know if anyone, well, I know you've read Raj Chetty, has done some work on how place matters for economic opportunity, and it influences wages. Where a child grows up influences the wages they have over their lifetime, and also opportunities for intergenerational mobility, whether they'll be as well off or even better off than their parents, which is kind of the whole American dream, and it's not working out anymore. But place matters for that, including down to the neighborhood level. So technology has played some part. It's not the only reason, of course, but it's played some part in this growing inequality. It's concentrated more economic activity in what's been called brain hubs or tech hubs, these ecosystems of innovation, these big superstar cities. Tech firms are attracted to where there's a skilled workforce, and innovation more and more depends on the exchange of ideas and knowledge. So there's an advantage to these big global cities, places like Sao Paulo, right? The density, urban density and diversity means that all these interactions take place, and it sparks more innovation. And you get these multiplier effects. So, and that's more true for IT than for the manufacturing economy. So we see, not only the growth of these superstar cities, but some regional shifts, which I won't go into today, but different regions of the country. And we see especially young people being more attracted to some of these big cities, the tech hubs, and in regions that are growing. So it's kind of ironic because we've talked about the death of distance with technology, but in fact it's really concentrated economic activity more, and in many ways means that place matters even more than it did before. And so why is this so? Well, technology has also increased the premium for education and for skills for individuals and for places. We talk about skill-biased change, but it means that people need to have more education, for one thing, to get good jobs. And so Moretti, this economist, has said that the 21st century basically is the human capital century. That's what matters for economic growth. And we know that it's really the individual skills and the individual human capital, that's what creates growth in communities. It's really at the heart of modern growth theory, that it's the spillovers and the multiplier effects that matter for community outcomes, and that's based on the aggregation of these individual level skills in the community. So economists usually measure this in a really narrow way, though, thinking about the skills that people have. They just look at college education, and okay, I teach college students, that's important, but we know these superstar cities have a lot of IT employment and educated residents. But we are arguing that this is really kind of a narrow way of looking at human capital, and it's not the whole story, and perhaps not what's always important for prosperity and growth in a community. We think that in public policy, we're really neglecting other aspects of skill and human capital, which is digital skills. So we know that technology use and skills matter at the individual level for wages, including for less educated workers with high school education or less, for middle skilled jobs, for economic mobility up the career ladder. And there have been studies from the OECD. This matters across countries. But that's all at the individual level. We are arguing that we need to think about this as human capital, digital human capital for communities. Do people, do they use the internet? Do they have digital skills for jobs and entrepreneurship? And that's not just for IT jobs, but we know technology matters for jobs throughout the economy. It matters for access to information, for people to develop their own human capital, for getting an education, for searching for jobs, for health so that you can stay healthy and work. Esther Hargitay has called these human capital enhancing activities online. And for information networks in the community. So I talked about, these interactions in big metropolitan areas. To the extent that more people are online in a community, that there are more people participating in a community on the internet, we think that there should be more spillovers and multiplier effects from that, from these interactions online in the networks as well as in physical spaces. And of course, the more inclusive those networks are, the more value they have and the more the benefits should grow. So the question is, does this digital human capital, and I'll talk about how we measure it in a minute, does that create local opportunity and prosperity? Well, in the U.S., we haven't had good data below the national level to answer this. What we've had is data on availability, whether there's some internet service in the area, but not how many people are actually using it, have broadband subscriptions, have adopted the internet, as a measure of use. And for all the reasons Ellen talked about, for poverty, affordability, lack of skills, there are a lot of reasons that adoption or, having an internet subscription or using the internet is not the same as just having the service available in your area. And in fact, Brookings has talked about this as the subscription gap, and that's more important than the infrastructure gap in the U.S. So we do have some research on how that availability matters for community outcomes. And basically, the short story is it has positive effects. But sometimes the research is found only for businesses and not for residents. Again, you're looking at just whether internet service is available. There was one study of rural counties in the U.S. that there were these rough measures that I won't go into, but kind of rough measures of broadband subscriptions in the area by quintiles, and they found even that had a stronger impact on economic outcomes for the community than these availability measures. So we want to ask how broadband subscriptions, using that as a measure of broadband use, how does that matter for metropolitan areas? And it's important to look at metros because they're, the drivers of innovation in the economy. That's most of the national economy in many countries. In the U.S., it's 2/3 of the economy and 3/4 of the population. So there is some research saying advanced uses of the internet by businesses do lead to higher wages in those metros, but only in the top 6% of metros with the largest populations, highest income, and high IT industry, the superstar cities, okay? So it matters there, but not anywhere else. But that's just looking at how businesses use the internet. It's not looking at how the population uses the internet or digital human capital in communities. So we have some data. There's some new data coming out from the American Community Survey. They just started collecting some data on broadband subscriptions since 2013, and only data coming out last year for 2017 for all geographies. But we had a National Science Foundation project where we used multi-level modeling to estimate from another survey with a somewhat smaller sample from the census broadband subscriptions for the 50 largest metros and for some other areas, but we're looking at the 50 largest metros here. So I'll skip through this. We can talk about multi-level modeling later, but this is how we estimated broadband subscriptions from the national data. And the way that we're defining this, the census, we're using the census definition. If people had cable or fiber or DSL or even a cell phone, although that was counted as broadband. The only thing not counted as broadband was dial-up. And now, of course, there are some differences in speeds and capabilities for those different means of access, but it's all counted as broadband here. So nationally, we know that about 83% of the population, that should be the one-year estimates, has some kind of a broadband subscription, if you include cell phones. Looking at the metros, there, because it includes the suburbs and wealthy areas as well as poorer areas, they're not terribly far apart. But you see San Jose and Silicon Valley, 89% of that metro area has some kind of broadband subscription. Memphis, Tennessee, for the metro area, again, all the suburbs, and that's 71%. But if we look in these zip codes that look more like the neighborhoods within these areas, it goes from 95% in some zip codes in neighborhoods in San Diego to only 26% in Memphis. So there's a lot of inequality within the metro areas. What we look at here, though, using this data on the 50 metros, is whether increases in the percentage of the population with broadband subscriptions, is that related to prosperity, growth, full-time employment. And we do some interactions for millennials and IT employment because that's been important in the literature. So I just want to say we do time series, and that's important because we want to get at what causes prosperity or growth. Is broadband, did the broadband increase in broadband adoption come first and then cause prosperity later, or is it just more prosperous communities that have a higher rate of broadband adoption? So we need time series to get at this issue of causation. You can see trends flattening out over time in the 50 metros. So maybe I don't need to get into the weeds, but I can go back to this in questions. We did a lot of models, different kinds of time series, Price-Winston estimation. We did durations to detrend the data. We did cross-sectional time series. So we looked at this a lot of different ways. And looking at broadband subscriptions from 2000 to 2017, we, of course, controlled for things like education, employment, median income, race, ethnicity, age, employment by industry in 14 different categories. What we used for there are two indices from Brookings Metro. Prosperity, which is wages, productivity, standard of living, so that includes benefits for residents. We looked at full-time employment separately, and growth. Their growth measures are changes in gross metropolitan product, jobs in new firms. They're more business-oriented for the growth measures. So I'm going to summarize this. You probably can't see these check marks. I told you we did all these models, right? So consistently across the different models for prosperity, broadband mattered no matter how we measured it. For growth, it mattered for this kind of baseline model, but not for the more difficult test of looking at whether change over change from the previous year mattered, or so the results for growth, it did matter, but they were less strong. The relationship was less strong. For full-time employment and for prosperity, it was consistent.
And maybe I'll just flash these and you can ask to see them. But, this is broadband subscriptions in the previous year and change in broadband subscriptions since the previous year. And you can see that, that's kind of what I showed you, the summary for prosperity and growth and full-time employment. So graphing those with probability estimates, on average, a 10% increase in broadband subscriptions increases the prosperity score for a metro by about 2 percentage points, or, in the cross-sectional models, 3 percentage points. When you consider how many people are in those metros and you're increasing full-time employment, say, by 2 percentage points, it's the same for full-time employment. You're increasing that by 2 percentage points. That's a lot of people. And considering, it's just a few percentage points, but considering all of the things that influence economic outcomes, this is a substantively significant result. So again, in either case, a 10% increase in broadband produces about a 2% increase in either the prosperity index or full-time employment. We looked at interactions with millennial populations, and as we would have predicted, having a higher share of millennials in the community along with broadband subscriptions. It increases the benefits of broadband subscriptions, especially once they reach about 30% of the population, but it matters even without millennials. It's not required to have millennials in the population for broadband subscriptions to matter. We looked at interactions with IT employment, and it matters there also. But again, it magnifies the effect. There's this interaction. But even without IT employment, you still get some modest effect just from broadband subscriptions. And in fact, in IT employment, it matters more in early to mid-2000s, and later, you see here, over time, the IT employment matters less. And broadband subscriptions is more important over time. So it's really in the earlier period that having the technology industry there was important. So to sum up, broadband subscriptions over time, we argue we have a lot of evidence that may be causally related to prosperity, especially wages and standard of living, benefits for residents in the community, and also full-time employment. We see some relationships with growth, although that's somewhat weaker, and that's more for business. We see an effect where with millennials and IT employment, the effect is higher for growth and prosperity. And that makes sense because that suggests there are multiple kinds of digital human capital in the community. But it's not required. Broadband subscriptions alone matter in these models. It differs over time, as I mentioned. So in a way, this doesn't really conflict completely with the narrative of the superstar cities. You're even better off if you have IT employment and millennials and so forth. But on the other hand, it's not necessary. It's a more inclusive path that a lot of communities, if they adopt a policy where they increase digital inclusion in their community, that they can see some economic benefit. You don't have to be a superstar city, that's not available to every place. And technology use in the local population is significant in all these models over time, and it matters especially for prosperity and employment. In other words, not every place needs to land in Amazon.
Perfectly on time.
Oh, okay. I thought he was running
So,
over.
Thank you both for both the contribution and for concluding on time, 30 minutes each. So it's time for us to discuss the presentations, to make questions, to make comments. So if you want to make your questions in Portuguese, we can help. Ellen fully understands Portuguese, but if you want to address a question to Karen, Fabio will be happy to translate. We can help with the translation.
Sure. I'm Mr. Jorge Oliveira from Institute of International Relations. Can you explain a little bit more about your data, the fact that increased the percent of people not interested on digital? Because it strikes me this data, at least considering Brazil case, you considering general on a U.S. Okay, thank you.
Would you like to? Yeah.
No, I don't. I don't know my slides. Not what I know by. Right. Yeah. So this was. So there's two things going on. This is actually UK data. Yeah. And this from the Oxford Internet Surveys. Where we see kind of a, I think you showed a kind of plateauing effect. We see that everywhere around the world. So what we can see is that as what we might call the low-hanging fruit, the easy to get online people have gone online, what we see happening in that last bit is that the people who are still left are really have such a combination of problems, and live in neighborhoods. I had to skip through the slides to be able to finish on time. But this is what kind of was on that effect of kind of the problem of homogeneity in a way, is that a lot of the aspect of interest is not because they haven't heard that technology might do stuff for people, but when we look at the more qualitative work that's behind that, what is behind that interest, is that they're saying, it's interested for, of course it will help society, or it's good for learning, or it's good for getting a job, but it's not good for me. So they don't see that it will be beneficial to them. And it's so general national awareness campaigns, for example, have very little effect on these people in terms of their interest. So the reason why it's gone up a lot is that because that population that is not online is quite a different population from the one that was not online in 2005. And that population now is living in environments that are very homogeneous, where actually for them, probably relatively compared to people that they know and that they are interacting with, it doesn't make as big a difference. So that this is the kind of collective effect also that Karen is talking about, right? So if you live in a city where almost nobody uses technology, or in an area where nobody uses technology, or your network of people is very low skill and doesn't use it, that's kind of what's behind that. That kind of idea of, I'm not really interested, because yes, it's good for those people in New York or in California, or maybe for the millennials that, have high education. But for me, I can get my groceries without it. All the things that I need are there. Yeah. It's an ecological effect. Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things in that is that this is why the global comparison is so interesting, is that this is especially the case in societies where there is less inequality in education and things like that, where this is really marginalized groups. So, for example, when we do this research in Chile, we don't see that effect to the same extent, because there you could have not gone to university and still be a very entrepreneurial, highly engaged with lots of opportunities. We don't see that in the same way, because it's a very different indicator. But ironically, in some of the societies that are, more equal in terms of skill levels, we see this accumulation of things that people feel marginalized from society, and society is digital. So I'm not part of that. Yeah. So while if there's a society where there's much more that's not digital, then people feel like, oh, you know, I can be part of that as well because I have something to offer that world, and the world has something to offer me.
So that's really good, and I'd like to just add to that. So some of the things that I didn't show, of course, both of us have years and years of research and multiple projects. I lived in Chicago for a time. I was at the University of Illinois at Chicago and evaluated a project the city of Chicago was doing, a digital inclusion project. And what we did is we got some funding to do citywide surveys so we could look not only at broadband subscriptions, but ask people about barriers to technology use, what they did online. And so there were a lot of people who used public access or that and didn't have home access in poor neighborhoods. You can see that, would try to go online for job search. But you saw these clear patterns, these neighborhood patterns of disadvantage, and it was the geography of poverty, basically, in Chicago, the west side, the south side. It was poor, lowest income African American and Latino communities, but there were differences across those communities. So there was this intervention, the Smart Communities program, that we evaluated, and I spent a lot of time in the communities besides the data we collected, and found out that, they had to kind of tweak the training and how they did outreach and the things they did in the different communities, especially comparing kind of these immigrant gateway communities, the barriers and the experience people had in the mostly African American neighborhoods was different. But by having community organizations deliver those programs, they customized them and adapted them to the community that they were embedded in. And we saw some real results. They were able to move in like 2 years. Statistically significant differences in those neighborhoods compared to the rest of Chicago neighborhoods. They were able to bring about neighborhood level change, and it was home adoption, internet use anywhere, broadband at home, job search, health information, and mass transit. Those were the things where you saw the difference. So you could tell what motivated people and why they needed to go online. But, it took really a community-based approach to deal with it.
That just reminded me of one thing. One of the things that we have been noticing is the real importance of social capital. So there's two sides to this. Like, communities have really strong social capital that is like community cohesion and things like that. If an intervention is, or a program or whatever it is in relation to the digital is done in the wrong way, it's much harder to get them on because as a community they see it as a threat from outside. But if it's done in the right way, bottom up, with people working with local organizations, it does really work in the way you're describing. And one of the things that we're seeing is that one of the things that makes it really hard for those people to not get online is social isolation, so a lack of social capital. So this is people who feel not only that they don't belong to the societies that they live in and, that it's not of interest to them, but also that have very little contacts with people either in the neighborhood and the community that they live in. Social isolation is one of the variables that we've started including more and more and more. And the quality of the social networks and support that you have, we're seeing determine for a really great extent these outcomes. So people who are, have very little social capital have less positive outcomes from the same types of use and more negative outcomes from the same types of use. So it's really interesting because it's something that we haven't, it's not part of those kind of traditional indicators that we use to think about inequality, but social isolation and the relation, like well-being, is actually really important. So if you have very segregated neighborhoods in the sense of like there's all these individuals living there with no connection to each other, it's really hard to get the people who are not online or not doing certain things or achieving certain outcomes to actually change that. So that's something that we've been really, so you might have to build that before you can even do anything else in some ways.
Anybody else?
Hello, I'm Fabio, student from the department.
I have a very easy question. You both make a very new perspective on really measuring how differences in access, use, and skills, resources online makes difference in outcomes or growth or results. So how you can measure effectively the effect of this. But my question is on how you connect this with an overall debate on inequality. So in the end, the debate is that, okay, to define who are the winners or losers in the moment, it's just you have to include another variables, or we can say that overall, these studies confirm the idea that we are getting more unequal because of technology, because of the. How do you connect this with this debate on inequalities, income inequalities in general?
So, kind of high level, big picture, which is where I started. Technology is one of the factors. You know, as I showed, it's structural change in the economy, and it has in some ways increased inequality. But, you know, technology doesn't determine social outcomes. What we do as a society, the choices that we make, the choices that communities make, we kind of end up the book. Okay, there are choices here. A lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of communities in the U.S., I teach local government management, and I've done things on economic development, think, well, we just have to land a technology firm. We can do things, the choices that we make about social welfare, about education and support and training and community resources, the choices that we make about making sure that there's affordable broadband and, for people to have regular access. There are a lot of choices that we make as a society, and, the institutions, the political and economic institutions that we have and the policy choices we make matter. It's not technology just driving it. It's so the same technology is going to have different outcomes from disruption. There's a lot of talk about the future of work and AI. You can imagine in a place like Sweden, the way that can be handled with the institutions there is very different from the United States, where we're very laissez-faire. So, it's not only just about the technology, it's about how we shape our policy to make opportunity available even in the midst of social change. We've gone through periods of social change and economic change before. We have choices to make.
I'm going to make a relatively similar point, I think, but I would say, in a way, the digital is an accelerator, of some of the patterns that we are seeing. Economic inequality has been increasing for a very long time. It didn't, in the countries where it's increased, it didn't start with technology being implemented. But what we see in our research when we look more at time series is that it is kind of an accelerator of certain processes. And this is just in an economic sense. And I think my question for Karen would be, so that's great, increase broadband subscriptions, but how do we increase broadband subscriptions? That's probably the really hard thing to do. But I think, so I'll take it from a slightly different, because some of the work that I'm doing right now is really more, goes kind of, beyond that access aspect and looks at things like content creation and how that's unequally distributed, also in terms of the outcomes and the people. Like from very basic things like posting images or photos on a post on Facebook or messaging through WhatsApp to creating a blog or a vlog or something like that. And what we see there is as, we live in interesting times, right, where certain types of discourses have become much more acceptable. For example, discrimination in terms of ethnicity or sexism, and that we can see like tipping points there, whereas there becomes a separation where discrimination becomes more accepted, then that also is kind of accelerated in these online spaces. And one of the interesting things that we see, you were talking about AI and these kinds of things, what we see is that we get a further segregation online in that as well. So that we could see where people who don't have their voices heard, they get like, it's not that they, in the general public, or they get very lot of negative reactions. It's not like they go offline, but what they do, they go in private spaces, which are like safe spaces, yeah, which is, so they feel respected, they get to express their opinions. But what happens, and this is the kind of negative aspect for it as a society, not for these individuals, is that a normal person browsing YouTube or, you know, any kind of content creation platform will not come across that content anymore, because they're kind of they're fleeing towards safe spaces, yeah, where they're surrounded by people who they can trust and who are like them. We've all heard about filter bubbles. So filter bubbles are often talked about in a negative way, but they're also often a space where people who are discriminated and who get a lot of negative feedback in society, where they can actually be themselves and talk to people in safe spaces. So in that sense, it accelerates some of these processes that we see around society. So that means, on the reverse, if you do something about that segregation and the polarization, the technology can also help change that and accelerate that. So it started the presentation by saying we need to think about the context and the embeddedness. Like, where are you introducing technology in? If you introduce WhatsApp in a society that's extremely sexist, where violence against women is good, what is WhatsApp going to be used for? Yeah, it's going to be used for those things. Yeah. So, but it could also be used for good things if you change that kind of environment. So that's interesting, you know. And
so just like in a sentence, that's kind of technology is accelerating or driving some of this inequality, but different aspects of it can present some solutions too. More inclusive use in the population, that can present one solution to this.
I'd like to add a question on this point, but more related to the political effects of the digital inequality. Because on the one hand, we tend to think that, let's say, digital media turned out to be the, let's say, a very relevant and influential arena on people's political choices. Say we are, let's say, we as political scientists, we've been invited to think about the role of digital tools on people's political decisions, and we tend to think that let's say the importance of these devices are more or less equally distributed across society. So we tend to believe that in Brazil, the last elections were decided by WhatsApp. Brexit decision was deeply affected by fake news diffused through media and so on. So. But we came to understand after these 2 days of discussions that access to digital media is very unequally distributed, even in some within cities. Across metro areas, so in some metro areas of the states, only 26% of the population is using these tools. So it can be that can it be that this unequal access to the internet also unequally affects people's political choices? So this effect is not so evenly distributed across the territory, and so the way we've been thinking about that have somehow missed how unequally distributed these political tools have been thus far. So I would like to hear you a bit about that.
Well, we know there's a huge literature that says it matters for, and I've done some of the studies with colleagues, it matters for voting, it matters for internet use, matters for especially use of online news, for political interest and political knowledge, for mobilization. Obviously, social media has you mentioned some examples, has offered all kinds of new ways of mobilization. But we're also seeing challenges now that more people are using digital media to talk about politics, to get information about politics. Of course, misinformation and everything. So more and more, yes, people who have no access to this information often don't go vote, don't have a voice, don't get access to information so that they can participate. But also we're seeing that it's important to have some of the kinds of skills that Ellen mentioned. And with colleagues, I've done things on information literacy, being able to evaluate the credibility of information, and use it. And so all of the things about misinformation, it can be really difficult to sort it out, but the more savvy people are about cues, about information online, how to find it, how to judge it, that's one solution that can help in this environment too.
I'm writing this book on the digital disconnect, which should have been done last week, and it's not done. But and so one of the chapters that I also talk about is exactly this aspect of it. And I think actually civic and political participation is a really interesting area of it, because it's one of the areas where we see some things that we might not have expected. So yes, in general, it's related to skills. But sometimes having more skills, a little bit as what I showed with the vulnerability, makes that actually you're less confronted with things that are very different from you, because you become very skilled at picking the kinds of things that are just, right for you. You don't get confronted with stuff that is confrontational. So there was a really interesting study done, and I can't for the life of me remember the name of the author, but in Britain, for example, on fake news. And the people who were most exposed to fake news, and the problem with fake news is not that it's fake in a way that confirms your views. Because we don't read fake news that it doesn't confirm what we believe, right? We only like fake news that. And the group that was most exposed to it, and that was most pushed in a certain direction, was like white older men. The people that we would normally say, oh, these are these people, the people who rule the world, right? But they were actually in a position, because of the kind of resources that they have, and because they didn't have to bother with being confronted with anybody else, and they had kind of the skills. They were the ones who were most, least politically informed in a way, because they weren't confronted with it. So I would say that is one interesting aspect of an area where actually we might see some patterns that don't correspond with how we normally think about inequalities and aspect. The other thing that I was going to say, McIlwain has done quite interesting work in the US around how, to what extent, because technologies they don't come from the mud, right? They're designed by human beings. We have a lot of talk about algorithms and how they push, and to what extent. And there is a really, especially for political and civic participation, really important question to ask is like, how could these platforms be designed differently to expose people to opinions and to people who have very different lives or different, and just mere exposure doesn't necessarily work, but non-exposure, it definitely doesn't work. But the interesting thing is that like the way that these platforms are built right now, they are built on a model to not do that. They can't make profit from confronting you with stuff that you don't want to see. That's not. And so this is when I was talking about there needs to be a collective awareness to the consequences of inequalities in, these kinds of things, that actually as a society, as a collective, we're going to be worse off. And I think that is the interesting thing about what's happening right now. And we're going to have to see what goes on, because there's a lot of awareness creation, not just about that there is fake news and that some people are seeing it, but that actually this has very, like, an effect on our democracy, or if we can still call what the countries that we live in democracies, that it's very negative. And there's nothing an individual can do about that necessarily, but it is something that is going to be a combination between people designing algorithms, people being aware that, hey, why am I only going to videos by, you know, men, or also on a range of different topics, while when I look at women's vlogs, it's only about beauty vlogging, right? This is a very clear trend that it's like women are only allowed to talk about certain things and men have a diversity of topics. So it's going to be a collective consciousness, I think, for this to change, you know, and that involves tech companies, that involves policymakers, that involves people who have traditionally been active for issues that were not digital, and see how this is, you know, impacting them. But it's a really complicated process, you know, these changes take time and it needs to be collective. You can't do that at an individual level. But we have seen, you know, the Me Too movements, we can see also that there is a visibility to it. Even if there's only the people who are really actively participating are a kind of liberal elite in some of these prospects, there is a visibility and awareness that people say, like, this is what's going on? Oh, wait, 1 second, yeah? So I'm not completely negative about that. The future technique. Yeah.
That's the ability to mobilize in new ways.
Yeah.
So.
Any further question? So thanks a lot for coming. Thanks, Fabio, for providing us this opportunity. But thank Karen and Ellen for these great two opportunities to hear about your work. It was very, very nice to have you here among us. Thanks for coming.
So, I'm going to take.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. See you on Monday. This is really very interesting line of research.
So the downside of our research is that we have to get things out quickly because technology changes so fast. Your writing gets outdated. You don't have a lot of time to sit there and go over it. No, wait a few more months and get this out. The upside of it is it's continually interesting because there are new topics and changes. And, every day.
But it's also, I think, it's also our job to say, like, okay, there's a lot of new stuff, but actually a lot of the things that we know still apply, you know? Like, because sometimes, like, I sit in my class, I do this class on interpersonal mediated communication, and people are like, oh, you know, our lives have changed completely. And I'm like, okay, what are the basic things that are important for you? You know, it hasn't changed. You know, some of it is just tools, and some of it is qualitatively different. But it's very interesting, that thing is like, what if all the stuff that we still know can still be applied and used, and what is, you know.
Well, information literacy didn't start with the internet.
No.
It got more challenging because sometimes the cues aren't there. That you had gatekeepers in the media, but it didn't start with the internet.
Yeah, it's not like propaganda has just been invented right now, right?
Right.
And actually, and the interesting thing about Brexit is that it was probably not social media. You know, it was traditional political populist campaigning, driving around with the bus. You know, with like a slogan on the side is will make the difference.
Close the window.
All this water. I will definitely have some water. Yeah.
My second one of this. Oh, use it for that. That's right. Take one. What I have at the hotel is like one of these huge bottles, and it's not very portable.
Especially for tomorrow, if you do it first.
Yeah, it would be good to carry something around instead of carrying around what?
A liter and a half of. Yeah.
Now, Charles McGowan has been doing really interesting work on, like even when websites have a lot of connections, like physical, like they're kind of built connections that are not based on themselves. There's like really complicated way of figuring out what the origin of the sites are. Like even then, like even when the past and the roots are there, there's still something about how people move along this path. Yeah, that's right. There's like a tendency for scientific methods to but then when they are directions,
Even when they're not,
so there is a thing about do you want to, if you think about a process that would be like the example that I was using with in the UK, so 50, the top 50 blogs, there's about 7 that are everybody. Of those 7, 5 are bloggers. One is and then, not more, they talk about millions of different things, right? And so, but it's when you ask people to look at the they're not aware of it, right? And they just, they're really interested in sports. And it actually doesn't really matter if you present them with both options. I just go Google as a man. So it's not like it's intrinsic, like aversion to it, but it's just somehow, that's so there's a lot of talk about it. Maybe as a website, you can do the whole thing like this, then we can like this, not basing it on people's choices, like I'm also want this very similar content with a design algorithm that push content by people, like where the authors are not like
sobre ele não aconselha. Ele se acha ótimo.
and it doesn't go against the visual because it's still
Eu sei qual que é.
Sim, eu acho que
Ele tem um rosto meio jovem, o cabelo não combina com o rosto.
Acho que é esse mesmo.
Eu sei qual que é.
Não é? Agora na descrição, né? Mas acho que é esse mesmo. Eu confundo sobre. Eu consumo sobrenomes. Eu sei que um você fala mal, todo mundo fala mal e o outro não. Então ele é o outro. É o outro.
Some research on attitude to control.
agora tem que
Pegar isso aqui, imagine going to Facebook.
we have like we're almost at the point where
Eu acho que vou ter que levar ela na minha sala, porque ela tão carregada.
Eu levo pra você.
Tá. É que você não está acompanhando elas?
Posso pedir pra ela.
Marcos, você está indo embora? Você está indo embora? Tá? Não, tudo bem. Você vai subir, Fábio? Thiago?
Estou indo com o Marcos.
Todo mundo vai.
Tem que fazer alguma coisa aqui hoje?
Tem que.
Você quer que leve lá em cima? Daqui, velho.
Por que eu não peço chorando que ele não faça tempo?
Nada, mas tem carro. A gente carrega. Nunca mais vou virar professor aqui, tá?
Wait 1 second, I'm going
It's not about presentation.
A vida inteira.
Ok, não, ele diz o Paulo
I
Dente
studied
que
law.
ele só veio para o Brasil para não carregar pasta na Itália.
Research groups about public policy and I was interested in this master program, Inequalities and Social Science.
Yeah, I'm part of the International Performance Institute, and I'm part of that as well. So I'm at the Department of Media and Communications, but the International Equalities Institute that runs this master is across a lot of the different departments at the end.
I already read but I'd like to know what are they looking for? I mean,
Or
so
their own
like, it's
cultural
not that different
centers and
from
museums.
the rest of the
Yeah.
LSE, right? But so with the LSE, when you apply for these kind of things, like masters or whatever, obviously your grades, because there's a lot of people that are important. So the grades is the first thing, right? But it's really important, like you have to write a personal statement. Yeah. So if your grades are reasonable and you apply, then the personal statement is really important in the sense of that you like show like an understanding, like kind of a theoretical understanding in connection with, you know, why is it important for society. Like the LSE is very much, you know, it's a theoretical, critical social science university, but it's also applied, right? So it has to deal with social issues that are relevant. If you have a project that you already worked on, from which something came up where you kind of, you know, a kind of frustration is like, I need to know more about this. I don't feel like I have the tools, or the way in which people have answered the question before, or ways that have been implemented by policy is not really right. So they're looking for somebody who can take what's out there, sufficient knowledge, and say, this is kind of, you know, I think it has to be done differently. And if you apply for a master's, then it's probably, I think it has to be done differently, but I don't, you know, I need the tools to be really engaged with that. If you apply them for a PhD, you can take the next step and you say, okay, so this is what's been done, and like it's not right, and this is maybe a suggestion. You know, I'm going to do a project on it. But with the master's project, that's really it. They're looking for somebody who's, you know, kind of driven, passionate, engaged, and kind of can really see why it is.
I haven't given out my cards, so you'll get one. I can justify.
Like, for example, saying like, oh, I want to be at the LSE because the LSE is one of the best. You know,
I will send you. But as far as I get home,
it's really about
send
like,
you.
what is something that will bring to you, and showing that you know what you're doing research on. You know, like which courses, if there's courses that you're particularly interested in, across the LSE.
So tomorrow I'm going to hang out, and then Thursday just kind of do email and a few things and get ready to go.
So if you have an idea,
we may talk on Thursday, and so now it's kind of the time to just relax and enjoy being here in Brazil.
Job done.
No,
Very well done
this is
indeed.
a terrible thing, you know, but I'm going to be like just
It's,
honest.
I love
grades
this
are the basis.
opportunities.
Everybody who
It was
applies
a deep.
And if you're above a certain level, it doesn't matter, you know, whether you have like, in English terms, a distinction or, you know, a 68 high pass or a really high distinction.
Desligou tudo? Você conseguiu desligar?
So
Não,
once you
menos o
pass the
microfone, que eu acho
threshold,
que ele que ligou lá no
you're
fundo, não
fine.
sei como. A câmera está aí ainda, vai ter que voltar.
like since you're here, I would get an academic reference. Yeah, just, and from somebody who actually knows you, you know, in general for references, don't just ask a big name, right? But ask somebody who, yeah. And somebody, it's better, of course, if you know somebody who, you know, is like, has written something interesting and that other people might know and they know you.